In the beginning, when the earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the deep, God created the heavens and the earth. The heavens, in Hebrew thought, is always plural, referring to the sky, the vast, high space where God's presence dwells and rules. The earth was a lush, perfect garden called Eden, a place where God's space and human space overlapped completely. In this perfect harmony, Adam and Eve, the first humans, lived in fellowship with God, walking freely in the garden, enjoying His presence, and tending to the creation. God, in His infinite wisdom and love, placed Adam and Eve in this garden, giving them a divine commission to care for the land and to multiply and fill the earth. Everything in Eden was lush and abundant, a reflection of divine blessing. The trees bore fruit freely, and a river flowed out of Eden, watering the garden and providing life for all creatures. It was a sacred space, a sanctuary where heaven and earth intersected perfectly. But the story takes a tragic turn. The serpent, a cunning creature, tempted Eve, and through her, Adam, to rebel against God's command. They disobeyed God's one restriction, eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This act of rebellion was not merely a moral failing, it was a breach of the divine order, a disconnection between heaven and earth. As a consequence, the harmony was shattered. Immediately, Adam and Eve felt shame and fear. They hid from God, for now, the divine presence was no longer freely accessible. God, walking in the garden, confronted them with their disobedience. As a consequence of their rebellion, God pronounced curses. The ground would now produce thorns and thistles, toil and pain would mark their labor, and ultimately, they would return to dust, experiencing death. The perfect overlap of heaven and earth was broken, and humans were now exiled from Eden. To guard the sacred space and prevent humans from re-entering and eating from the tree of life, God placed cherubim, angelic creatures with a fearsome, multi-animal form, at the entrance of Eden. These cherubim, with wings and fierce appearance, stood as guardians, wielding a flaming, flashing sword that turned back and forth. They symbolized the holiness and otherness of God's presence, powerful, pure, and dangerous to any unworthy intruder. This guardian barrier marked the separation between the divine and the profane, between God's holy space and the fallen world. The cherubim's presence underscored that God's holiness is both a source of life and a force that deters unworthy beings from entering His sacred space. The boundary was set, not because God wanted to punish humankind forever, but because of the profound holiness that must be protected. Humanity's rebellion had created a division, a schism, between heaven and earth, a division that would persist for generations. Despite this separation, God's plan was never to abandon His creation. Even in the fallen world, He established sacred spaces, temples, as points where heaven and earth could meet again. These temples, like the tabernacle and later the Solomon's temple, were not just buildings but symbols and pointers to the divine reality. They were designed to be sacred hotspots where God's presence could dwell among His people, and where humans could experience a taste of the divine harmony that was lost. The story of the Bible continued with the calling of a people, Israel, who were chosen to be a light to the nations. God made a covenant with Abraham, promising to bless him and his descendants and to bless all nations through them. Through Moses, God gave Israel the law and the instructions for building the tabernacle, a mobile dwelling place for His presence. The tabernacle, and later the temple built by Solomon, became the earthly center of God's presence, a holy place where heaven and earth overlapped once again. Yet, even the temple was a pointer, an imperfect reflection of the divine reality. It was a symbol of God's original intention, that His presence would fill the entire earth. But over time, Israel's leaders became corrupted, and the temple's purity was compromised. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel lamented that Israel had become like a rebellious son, turning away from God's covenant and corrupting His house. God, through the prophets, announced that because of their hypocrisy and idolatry, the temple's glory would depart, and it would be destroyed. Indeed, in 586 BC, the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem, tore down Solomon's temple, and exiled the people. The sacred space was lost, and the hope of divine presence dwelling fully among His people seemed shattered. Yet, even amid destruction, prophets like Ezekiel had visions of hope. Ezekiel's famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones depicted God's promise to revive and restore his people. The bones came together, flesh was restored, and breath, or spirit, was breathed into them. This was a symbol of Israel's spiritual resurrection and renewal, a foreshadowing of God's plan to recreate his creation. Throughout the prophets, a recurring theme emerged: God would one day renew the heavens and the earth. Isaiah spoke of a new heaven and a new earth, where sorrow, pain, and death would be no more. The New Jerusalem would descend from heaven, the holy city where God's presence would fully dwell once again, and all creation would be restored to its original harmony. Psalm 104 poetically describes a world where mountains drip with wine, hills flow with milk, and rivers flow from the temple, symbolizing superabundant life and divine blessing. The prophets envisioned a future where the division between heaven and earth would be healed, and God's space would fully overlap with our space. This was not about humans leaving the earth to go to some distant heaven, but about God's presence coming down to renew and transform the earth itself. The hope was for a new creation, where violence, injustice, and suffering would be no more, and peace would reign among all creatures. This hope extended to the restoration of relationships between humans and God, among nations, and even between animals. Isaiah foretold that predators like lions and lambs would coexist peacefully, and children would play safely among venomous snakes. All of creation would be healed, reflecting the divine harmony of Eden once more. The longing for this divine renewal was so strong that it influenced the thoughts of the people of Israel, and later, early Christians. They believed that God's presence was not confined to a building or a distant heaven but would come to dwell fully on earth again. When Jesus of Nazareth appeared, he embodied this hope. His life, teachings, death, and resurrection were seen as the beginning of God's kingdom breaking into the world. Jesus presented himself as the true temple, God's presence incarnate. When he entered Jerusalem, he challenged the corrupt religious system, overturning the tables of money changers in the temple courts and declaring that his body would be the new temple. His body, the community of believers, would become the new meeting place where heaven and earth would again overlap. The crucifixion of Jesus was a cosmic event. Curtains in the temple were torn from top to bottom, symbolizing that the barrier between God's holy space and human space had been torn apart. His resurrection was the ultimate sign that new creation had begun. Just as Ezekiel's dry bones were brought to life, Jesus' resurrection signaled that death itself was being conquered, and God's promise of renewal was underway. In the aftermath, Jesus' followers understood that the kingdom of God was not merely a future hope but a present reality breaking into the world through his Spirit. They became living temples, embodying the presence of God in their communities. The church, as the new temple, was called to be a sign of heaven on earth, working for justice, peace, and healing. The book of Revelation paints a final vision of hope, a new heaven and a new earth, where the sacred city, the New Jerusalem, descends from heaven, and God's presence fills everything. There, death, mourning, crying, and pain are gone forever. The Creator's original plan is fully realized, heaven and earth are united once again, and God's perfect reign brings eternal peace and abundance. This story tells us that God's ultimate purpose is not to whisk souls away to some distant heaven, but to restore and renew the entire creation. His presence will fully overlap with our world, bringing about a new creation where life and blessing abound forever. The divine guardian creatures, cherubim, will no longer stand as barriers but will be part of the renewed harmony, reflecting God's holiness and love. So, dear friends, remember that God's story is one of restoration. He longs to reunite heaven and earth, to dwell with his people in perfect harmony. The hope is not just for a distant place beyond the sky but for the fullness of God's presence to fill the earth as it once did in Eden, and as it will one day in the new creation. Please like, comment, and share this story to help others discover the hope of God's restorative plan. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories from the Bible. And may the peace of Christ, the true temple and the new creation, fill your hearts today and always.